My next guest is Maria Barrera. Maria is a Stanford-educated engineer and founder and CEO of Clayful. She is committed to addressing the youth mental health crisis. Born in Colombia and understanding the pressures of adversity, she leverages her experience from her pioneer role on Nearpod's founding team to create impactful solutions in education. Through her tireless research and collaboration with a diverse team of experts, Maria developed Clayful, offering accessible, preventative mental health resources to families of all socio-economic statuses. Her dedication to training a diverse mental health workforce and establishing partnerships with schools has already impacted thousands of students across the country. Welcome to the podcast, Maria.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, tell me about a time when you were in the trenches and managed to pull out.
Last week. It's funny because summer for education tends to be, a time of we're going to be resting and we're going to be sort of resetting for everything. But over the last couple of weeks, it's just been very, very hectic preparing for the back to school that's coming up.
Tell me how you got started with Playful. So I mentioned in your bio you were an engineer. So how did that lead you into wanting to work in the capacity that you do now? You also worked with Nearpod, so we could talk a little bit about how that kind of segued.
Yeah, it's a pretty unique background. So I actually thought I was going to be building airplanes and spaceships as my career. That was when I was in school. I wanted to be an engineer, and I went to school for mechanical engineering and worked at GE, worked at Boeing, and did the thing. And I always had a tutoring company or a tutoring gig as my hobby, right? I worked with kids every day after school on math and science, and it was through that work that I realize now that it wasn't about teaching them, the Pythagorean theorem, but it was about talking about whatever was on their minds, right? Whether that was, the test that was coming up to keep it academic, or the boy trouble they were having, or the fights with their family members, whether that was their siblings or their parents. So much of that time was really about holding space for big emotions and helping them, asking powerful questions to understand what was actually going on and what they felt that they needed. And again, that was very much my hobby until I realized that I wanted to be in education, not in aviation. And that's when I joined Nearpod to build out was right after they raised their Series A. They were building out their content store, and really it was the inflection point where devices were just making their way into the classroom, and we started to see sort of the impact that quote unquote simple technologies could have in the classroom and the lives, how it could change the lives of teachers and students. So I started there really aiming to sort of revolutionize what learning could look like. My first project was actually building the virtual field trips in the classroom, which, using the little cardboard cutouts that we had back then. And over time, I realized, how to build a product that kids wanted to use, that teachers would use, and that was making the teachers' lives easier in the classroom, and that administrators could pay for, right? Because you need all of those things to be successful in education and to make an impact in education. So those are some of the lessons that I think about in my day-to-day now, and are very, very much informing how we think about Clayful. The transition into Clayful, though, was really around the pandemic. So this was summer 2021, and seeing the impact that the pandemic had on all of our mental health, but particularly on kids, right? The lack of structure and schooling, the anxiety of what was going to happen, the lack of social interactions, and not being able to develop those cognitive abilities, like making new friends and talking to people, like looking them in the eye and seeing their mouth, or like all these things that are so core to how we grow as humans. um, we didn't have, right? And my hypothesis at that point was, wow, this is going to have a really huge impact, as it's already having a big impact on adults. And unfortunately, I was right. And you start seeing some of the stats around the rise in depression, rise in anxiety, the self-harm. And then you have, the rise of TikTok and the increase in social media use and how that affects restrictive eating. And there's so many of these things happening at the same time. And I realized I needed to be a part of the solution. So quit my job and started talking to people to figure out what that might look like, and slowly got to what we're doing now, which is working with schools to provide preventative mental health coaching to every student so that we can reach kids before they get to a breaking point, and to help them build resilience, build the coping skills, help them identify emotions, move through challenges, so that we're building a healthier foundation for what the future generation looks like.
Yeah, that's so neat how you transitioned from kind of working with developing an app for teachers to use, using your engineering school skills, and developing things that they could build virtually, but then using what you noticed happened during the pandemic, and kind of intertwining some of your previous experience. But when I first heard about what you do and talked to you in the pre-chat, it said that you started coaching already when you were 15. So you have that gift of just helping other teens. So tell me, like, what you did as a teen yourself to help peers who are struggling.
Yeah, one of my friends says I started Clayful to help like clone myself and like to just give everybody a Maria in their pocket. Um, it was, I mean, a lot of my friends, where middle school and high school is a hard time for a lot of reasons, right? I came to the US when I was 10, and I saw a lot of, I felt a lot of pressure, and saw a lot of my friends going through similar things, because my mom had come here to give me a better life, and I had to make that sacrifice worth it, or that's how I felt, right? So I couldn't show a sign of weakness. I couldn't say I needed help with anything, right? I felt that even though my mom's amazing and like would have totally been there to support me, I didn't want to put that burden on her, right? And I see so much of that in kids today, and I saw so much of that in my friends too. So, whether it was, let's call it Trojan horsing support through those pre-calc lessons. It's like, oh yeah, like here's like SOHCAHTOA, but also like, how are you doing? How are you feeling? Like that, what happened at school yesterday was really uncomfortable, and like, do you want to talk about that? And but a lot of the time that I spent tutoring with, whether it was my friends or my friends' siblings, it really was spending time just talking through what was going on in their lives. And that back then, I didn't have the official training that I do now, right?
Yeah.
I was taking, I remember sophomore year, I took AP Psych. So I had some skills back then, very basic.
Yeah.
But I've always been sort of a psych aficionado. And like, even when I was doing mechanical engineering at Stanford, I was taking all these psych classes on the side. People are like, what are you doing? Like, people take like French cooking or some other really interesting elective. And here I am, I'm like learning about child development. So as my hobby. So it's just been something that's, now that I look back, I see all these dots that were connected back then. And when I was 15, it really was just about like holding space and giving them an opportunity without judgment, and just being there. There's so much that you can do by just being there for someone and holding space without judgment.
Yeah, yeah. And also I think just hearing about your story, like you navigated a couple twists and turns like during the pandemic, but this was always that gift that you had. Like you said, you were already taking interest in psychology at Stanford, and you had that interest in helping people out, and now that you saw that need after the pandemic. So we're kind of looking at some of the residual effects right now as we begin the 23-24 school year. Like you said, you're preparing things for teachers, and I think it's still going to be a while with, kids that are feeling isolated. A lot of schools do a good job and trying to plug kids in with peers, but where do you see the future of student mental health maybe 5 years from now?
Yeah, one of the big changes I've seen, so I this is maybe weird, but I think about mental health and like the mental health system as like firefighting.
Mhm.
So, right now we're in this, and like through the pandemic, we've been in this full on like firefighting mode, right? There's all these forest fires, and our counselors, our psychologists, our social workers are out there putting out fires day in and day out. And what we're trying, and like they're busy doing that work, right? Like all the time. And what I hope we get to is the point where everyone has a fire extinguisher, and we talk about fire safety, and we have fire alarms, and there's a place where like we can do so much to prevent fires so that we're not always firefighting. So like that's a transition I'm starting to see, right? Like I look at a lot of states and the states plans that are coming out and district plans that are coming out, and this emphasis on prevention, this emphasis on resilience, and how do we help kids bounce back from emotions. And I think that will have such a big impact in helping as not just prevent, the worst of the worst, right? Like so much of what we've seen over the last couple of years has been the increase in suicide rates and gun violence in schools. And those are the fires that I'm talking about. And I'm really excited to get to a point where we're helping kids way before that happens, right? When that like one person looks at them funny in the hallway and makes them feel bad, like let's talk about that then, so that that doesn't grow into something that unfortunately can cause a dangerous situation for themselves or for others. And that's the thing, like that's how those things start, right? It's like a little kernel that then continues to escalate. So I'm talking to more school districts and talking to more counselors who are really interested in that work. And so that's my vision for, in 5 years, like we have this whole system of fire prevention that allows us to not just always be firefighting, because there won't be as many fires, and to truly sort of manage our resources accordingly, so that we're spending more time on that prevention.
Yeah, and I think also the tool is making sure districts have a capacity to hire more mental health professionals, because teachers feel like a lot of time they have to take on that mental health role that they're not always trained for. And although they build relationships with students and want to be that trusted adult, sometimes it is beyond what the teacher's capacity is. And, I think that's something that I think a lot of schools were looking at really closely during the pandemic, but maybe not as focused on right now for all the schools. But what is the data really showing us now as we start this next school year? In terms of what students are going through, like you mentioned a little bit about increased suicide rates. If we look at maybe ages 12 through 18, what are you seeing kind of the trends in the past year or so?
Yeah, so at a high level, we deal with a lot of academic pressure, friendship, like lots of peer conflict, lots of romance. So whether that's like, your typical middle school crushes, and like breakups, right? That is again very quintessentially the middle school and high school experience. We're seeing some bullying and social isolation. I think more social isolation than we've seen in the past, just given the pandemic and the lack of social skills. And conversations around family dynamics, right? I mean, so the data shows that. So there was a lot of caregivers who either lost their lives during the pandemic, the substance use increased during the pandemic, and divorce rates skyrocketed during the pandemic. So kids are really dealing with a lot of those like family fallouts in a way,
Mhm.
um, and trying to navigate that as best they can. So a lot of conversations about how to have conversations with family members, how to sort of draw boundaries with family members, and how to best support family members who might be struggling themselves.
Mhm.
Interestingly, I was trying to identify because we have demographic data as well. So looking at, you know, there's differences between like girls are talking about and boys are talking about, or what different levels of or different races and ethnicities are talking about.
Mhm.
Um, so we have some data around that, but like when I was also looking at, we do a screener up front for depression and anxiety, and to try to get a sense of like what are the things that kids are talking about if they're higher levels of need. And what's
Mhm.
fascinating there, and this goes back to this like, oh, a small kernel can impact a lot of things. It's like they're still talking about the same things,
Yeah.
right? It's still the sports, academic pressure, the
Yeah.
friendships. So much of that is still the same. Um, One thing I notice is the ones with more severe needs uh, talk more about self-esteem. Like, how do we help kids love themselves and feel
Mhm.
good about themselves, especially in a world where like you're on social media creating this alternative brand constantly, and putting all these filters and sort of putting on a different persona. I think like that there's a big opportunity there to help
Mhm.
kids with self-esteem, and especially as we look at those like higher level needs. So yeah, those are some of the things I've noticed. We can dive into any of the demographic data that's interesting.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, like you said, it's not necessarily new stuff. Like a lot of educators, I think, are thinking it's like social media and the influence. But I was also looking at a survey yesterday, because I tutor students in Norwegian, and it was actually a survey out of Norway that told about student social media use, ages 12 through 18. But they self-regulated, they said when they answered the survey, and how much they would use, or what kind of influencer they would follow and things like that. So sometimes maybe the data shows that the students aren't as addicted to that, or maybe not as like wanting to be pressured by that as much. And like you're saying, it's this pressure to get good grades. Sometimes it's the family dynamic, like you said, it's the maybe the isolation, not finding friends that they can connect with. So yeah, I think that's something that we need to continue to work on in terms of, you know, finding the right resources for our families. But like you said, I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into a particular subgroup. So students of color, especially those who maybe are in small communities. If there is a high school or a middle school that really, might have a school counselor, but it could be a larger school with only one counselor, not enough resources. So what does it mean for a student to talk to a counselor when it's in a small town? And how are the dynamics different in small districts?
Yeah, small towns are it's such an interesting sort of community or archetype, because where you do have so many beautiful things about being in a small town, like everyone knows each other, and you have these like strong communities, but at the
Yeah.
same time that means that everybody knows each other.
Yeah.
Right? So for you to step into the counselor's office, we might see at the supermarket later, and say something that you feel shame about, or that you're not, it's something that you're still like working through. It's a challenge that you don't know how to articulate yet, right? Like there's a lot. I mean, think about what it takes, the level of vulnerability that it
Mhm.
takes for you as an adult to have an honest conversation about your emotions, even with yourself,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then do that with an adult around you. And then, and think about that and all the steps that you have to go through, and then have that impose all those steps on a kid, right? It's a lot to ask of them.
Mhm.
So we're seeing that kids really want a space where they can feel that's judgment free, or that
Yeah.
they can sort of say the thing that's on their mind without feeling like, oh, that person's I'm gonna see them in the hallway and they're gonna like think of me differently.
Mhm. Mhm.
Because again, like especially this generation is so conditioned to have like a brand and a persona.
Yeah.
that, I mean, all of us care a lot about what other people think about us, but like, I
Mhm.
think because of the rise of social media, this generation is even more attuned to it.
Mhm.
And that means that, I mean, if we talk about BIPOC students in particular, you know, there's so many cultural stigmas, where like I'm from Colombia, and like very much a culture where you don't have you don't get therapy, like having therapy means like you're broken, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And it's not seen as a sign of strength to ask for help yet. We're hopefully changing that over time. I saw there's some bills out there that the administration is trying to pass through to make some changes there. But all those things matter, right? And so we really think about like, how do we normalize? How do we make it's like everyone has a bad day. It's not a big deal. You don't have to come to us with like the biggest, hardest thing that's ever happened to you. It's like you're just feeling lonely, or someone looked at you funny in the hallway. Let's talk about that. And it's okay to talk about the little things so they don't become big things.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, no, I think definitely, like you mentioned, there are certain cultural, um, stigmas, right? The kids that are, maybe in a large family, they feel like, they don't have time to care for themselves or focus on their problems. And I think, like you said, it does take a lot of, a lot of gumption, right, for kids to want to reach out to a counselor. So yeah, it's hopefully they don't put it off. They can work with others. I also wanted to talk to you a little bit about, there's a lot of chat about chat GPT and the use of just AI in schools, and increased use of just different apps for kids. And what can we do about the increasing, I would say, tech plus humans? Some people see it as a problem, some people don't. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I use ChatGPT quite a lot on my day to day for support and all the things about, running a business. Uh, and I'm so confident in our need for more human connection, not less. Right. So much of that what we missed during the pandemic was having that social connection, and that's connectivity. And sure, like every time I ask ChatGPT something, I'm like, hey, can you please do this? Right. I treat it kind of like a human. I
Yeah,
ask nicely, but
yeah.
it's not the same, right? And so like I've seen sort of screenshots on Twitter, or I guess X, of people talking about how they are treating ChatGPT or like the Snap AI as their therapist. And there's cognitive behavioral therapy is widely available. Like you can have some strategies there for sure. But so much of when we get feedback from kids, like what means the most to them is the fact that someone took time out of their day to listen to them. And I mean, you talked about the burden and kids feeling like a burden because they're going through something and not feeling like
Mhm.
they can speak up in a large family because there's so much going on.
Mhm.
And I was talking about like how so much of my time growing up was about like holding space and like holding that space and making someone feel special and heard. AI can't do that, right? Like that
Yeah.
is a uniquely human thing. So
Mhm.
we think a lot about, okay, how do we bring this human connection through via technology and make it really accessible? And how do we create layers of empathy, because of who our coaches are? So we hire coaches that are BIPOC, that have dealt with things, that dealt with things when they were growing up, that like really truly get it. So
Mhm.
because then that conversation, that connection is so much easier to have, because it's just like, oh yeah, I've been there. Like I know what you're going through, and the level of connection and empathy is just that much higher. Um,
Mhm.
I don't. I mean, maybe I'm old school, but I don't think we're going to be able to replace that with AI anytime soon. And then on the safety side, there's still a lot of challenges with AI, right? We're experimenting with some things, and like you can't tell AI not to do something. I like building those guide rails around it is really hard. And for a student who's struggling with self-harm or more acute needs, giving them, it's basically like a more powerful Google where you can get, yeah, sure, you can't ask it straight up like how to do X, but you can find ways around it, and kids are very good to finding ways around it. So there's a lot more work that these AI models need to do to create robust boundaries around it until it's like fully ready to be sort of like a therapeutic pal, if you will. And I know some companies that are out there working on it. A lot of them have decided to keep the model closed, right? It's not generative. It's actually a more closed off model because the generative piece isn't there yet. So lots more work to be done. I'm sure it will happen within our lifetime. And I still believe that there's so much value. And I still see that there's so much value that kids get from the human to human interaction.
Yeah, I don't think we can replace, that personalized, call. Somebody might have, a bot that they speak to, or, when it becomes more sophisticated, but it's not going to be the same thing. So, yeah, I agree with you in terms of like, it's not ready right now, definitely, but there's a lot of developments out there. Talk to me a little bit about how Playful works. If schools were to purchase Playful for the building or for the district, what can students do, and how can it be implemented in an advisory or an ELA lesson?
So we're really aiming to reach students where they're at. There's no surprise based on the rest of our conversation that that's on their devices. So either on their phone or on a school issued device, kids can go on and start chatting with a coach within 60 seconds. So the idea is, again, to help kids like in the moment when they're feeling the thing, to work through it right away. Through that session, they get all the coping skills, they talk through the challenges, they get really useful tips. And then we take that data and we're able to aggregate all that information into insights for the school. So then to the school, we can say like, hey, did you know that your students are actually really stressed out about these upcoming tests? And it's funny because sometimes the schools are like, wait, what? I thought they didn't care. Like these kids are showing up like not without even like a pencil in hand. I thought they just didn't care about anything. Like, no, actually they're paralyzed with fear. So it's quite the opposite.
Yeah.
And so it becomes a really meaningful conversation about what students actually need and the gaps in like what you're seeing and the actions and the behaviors are showing and the needs, like the emotional needs. And then as we started having more of these conversations, the schools were like, well, this is super helpful, but like, what do I do? Great question, especially at a time where schools are quite overwhelmed. So we started creating weekly lessons that teachers can do in advisory. The beauty of the lessons is they're all self-paced, so kids can go through on their own. Teachers don't actually have to teach any of it. It's the content's all taught through the lesson itself. And we tackle everything from like bullying, but we call it gossiping. It's like, oh, what happens? What role do you play in the gossip game? Or like, which anxiety animal are you? Because we love our quizzes. And it's become this really approachable, fun way of getting meaningful strategies into the hands of kids in a way that's meeting them where they're at cognitively and culturally, right? It's not your like old school sex ed tape that everyone giggles and laughs about because it completely hits the mark, but it's rather trying to try to meet them where they're at and actually resonate, so it actually resonates and they actually capture some of it. So with that's what teachers will do in advisory. And then of course, if there's another sort of mental health or SEL curriculum, they could leverage that as well. So this is like supplementary to that. And then can chat with the coach during that time. So whether they can chat right after, if that the journal sort of brought some things up for them, or if they're doing other lessons on on self-management or any SEL related stuff, they can also leverage that time to chat with the coach. A lot of them are, there's a lot of reading and writing attached to these lessons. So some teachers are doing it, and there's some schools are implementing them in ELA because it meets some of those standards as well. So it's been, we've even seen kids use it in foreign language classes because we can offer coaching in 132 languages. So they'll come in and start talking in French and like, oh, I'm practicing my French, but also like want to talk about this thing that's going on. So not a use case we planned for, but kind of a fun one to be able to support.
So if a school were to want to implement this, would they be able to use like a trial phase? Would they be able to just work with a small group of teachers first and then implement it school wide?
Yeah, we can be flexible for pilots. Our goal is really to work on like normalization, right, and reducing stigma. So we have a pretty strong point of view that it shouldn't be, just your special ed kids or just like your housing insecure population, but rather it's like a general ed pop where everybody can use support, because you also don't know who needs help because they may not already be on your radar. Yeah. So that would be the only constraint that we're pretty hard on. But other than that, we're pretty flexible for schools to be able to try it out in their school, really see the impact and be able to communicate that impact to the site lead or the district side.
Well, I think we've had a great conversation today around just your story and how you found your niche now and starting Clayful and using some of your experience from working with Nearpod and being an engineer. And then a little bit about just how, kids, what kind of mental health support they need and what their challenges are now. Out of everything we talked about, what's one thing you'd like listeners to remember?
I would like for them to know how important it is to make space for people and to remember that everyone has hard days, and you making that space and being there for them could make all the difference.
Where can people connect with you and find you online?
Yeah, so I actually created a little link for this community where if you want to chat with me about Clayful right away, you can go to clayful.co/trenches. And then if you want to just follow us on Twitter or Instagram, you can find our handle. It's Clayful Health. And we post and Facebook as well. And we post a lot of our tools. So on a weekly basis, we'll have some of the journals that I mentioned. We'll repost the tools that we're teaching kids on the social platforms. So if you want to learn how to apologize to each other or want to check out which anxiety animal you are, you can go on there and check out some of the strategies there.
Great. I'll make sure I put those in the show notes. Well, thank you so much for being on the Out of the Trenches podcast today. It was a pleasure learning more about Clayful and just your work in helping students with their struggles today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.